back to the Pat Flynn Show. We are joined once again by Dr. Brian Kemple. We're going to continue the conversation we began a couple weeks ago, which was a great chat. We discussed philosophical realism. We worked through various skeptical challenges, and here we are again. So, Dr. Kemple, thanks for coming back on the Pat Flynn Show. Super appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
So it's a lovely hot summer day, so it's great to be indoors.
Remind me where you are again in the world.
I am in Buffalo, New York, which normally is not a hot place, but today, last couple of days, it's been sweltering. It's humid. It's disgusting, and before I know it, it'll be 3 feet under snow.
Oh yeah, that's not too far off from how I would describe Wisconsin. So cheers, my friend, and gentle listeners. If you have any questions, we'll do some Q&A as we go through or towards the end, so you could submit those. But Brian, before we get started here, give us a little reminder of who you are and what you do, and I want you to talk about reality as well, because I've been working through that inaugural issue, and there's just lots of good stuff in there. So please, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Dr. Brian Kemple, got my PhD in philosophy in 2016. 2016. From the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. I wrote my dissertation under the inimitable John Dealey. And right now, I'm outside what you would call traditional academia. I'm running the Lyceum Institute, which is an online platform for developing philosophical habit in a great number of ways. We're trying all sorts of different interesting things. And I'm the executive editor of Reality, a journal for philosophical discourse. So yet another sort of alternative approach to academic things. I guess I'm a bit of a renegade, you might say.
A contrarian. We like a
contrarian.
We like your types around here, Dr. Kemple. So yeah, good to be on the show. And I will of course commend all those resources. If people have not already, the cool thing about Reality is the journal is, correct me, but it's still available totally free online, right?
Yeah, we do an affordable print edition, but we also of our major articles, but then we also have a lot more online, and everything that's in the print edition is available online as well.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. You know, you got to get the philosophy to the people. You really do. Now, at the same time, people support the good work they're doing. Buy the print edition. It's very nice. So and the inaugural issue, all on philosophical realism, is awesome. So if you're interested in these subjects, definitely pick it up. But what have you been thinking about in the meantime? What have you been currently working on?
Yeah, well, the Lyceum Institute just wrapped up our summer seminars last week, a week and a half ago, I guess. And so right now I'm in my long break period of 2 months between seminars. We've got 3 coming up in the fall, one on evil, one on art, aesthetics, and Thomism, and one on the metaphysics of God. So an interesting lineup. So that's sort of on my mind a little bit. I'm doing the metaphysics of God one. I've got 2 other great guys doing the other 2, Kirk Kanzelberger and Matthew Meinard. Possibly known to some of your listeners as a prolific translator of Gary Lagrange.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's been on my mind. I'm also working on, we have a trivium program, which is sort of relaunching, hopefully starting in September. So working on grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So I'm working on a long promised book on grammar and composition that I'm finally getting to the point of finishing.
Do you commend, this is a book I've commended many times, the Trivium, The Liberal Arts of Logic, Grammar, and Rhetoric by Sister Miriam Josephs. I just found that such a fantastic introductory text.
Yeah, it's actually, it's right here.
Is the orange one up there? That's it, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a great introductory text. It sort of shows you how these things weave together. And so it's a great one for getting introduced to these subjects.
Well, let's actually, if you don't mind, let's talk about the Trivium, because a lot of people might be listening to this and like, what is this fascinating word, right? But this is just so fundamental to classical education, yet where is it, right? Where's it gone?
Well, I think it's in a way it's exemplified by how the word trivial had its meaning changed. Right? The word trivial, okay, it's something that doesn't matter. Right? It's unimportant. But that's a word derived from the trivium, from the idea of these three subjects of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And the transformation which we see in the word trivial is that, okay, well, these things are, everyone sort of knows them, right? And they're not really important to know all the details. You don't have to worry about what each little thing means in grammar, subjunctive, mood, whatever, right? Let's just get rid of it. It's not important. So yeah, but when you look at the real tradition of education going back, not just to the start of our universities as they exist now, but the depths of the Western tradition of education, they were upheld as just like, you can't do anything without these, right? You're not a well-formed human being unless you've studied the trivium. And so we've gotten rid of the trivium, and now we don't have so many well-formed human beings anymore, it seems like.
Seems like that hypothesis has been tested.
So we're engaged in trivial pursuits, or we ought to be, in the proper meaning of that term, and not meaning as the game.
So how would you recommend, because I know you talk a lot about philosophical habit, how do you recommend it? And I also take it that maybe you're not quite as pessimistic as Aristotle. Maybe you are, but say somebody, say somebody wants to course correct, and they say, Dr. Kemple, I am not a very well-formed human being. Help me.
I mean, you kind of just Sister Miriam Josephs' books would be a great place to start, right? Pick that up and start looking through it. Really, finding people to talk with about these things is a huge part of it as well. We can read and read and read, but you're only getting part of what that reading is good for if you're just reading. Yes. Unless you have someone to talk with about these things and argue with about these things, you're not getting everything out of them that you could be, and you're certainly not producing the habits in yourself that you ought to be. One of the things that I encourage everyone to do is, even if it's just for a small audience, when you read a book, and if you don't have someone that you can sit down and talk with about it live, write something about it and send it to someone. Right? Here's my thoughts on this book. Even if it's just in an email or if it's a blog post or something like that, you really challenge yourself to concretize your thinking, to put it in writing.
Right. I love that tip. I forget where I first picked that up, but it was something that has stuck with me ever since, that almost whenever, I can't say that I do this every time, but almost whenever I'm done reading something, I try to make an argument around it. Simple, doesn't have to be long, can just be a couple paragraphs, right? But it's that active. I mean, Mortimer Adler talks about this so much in his book, How to Read a Book, right? You can't be passive, right? With your trying to increase, right, in your understanding, right? Otherwise you're just, okay, you can acquire information, but if you want to go from a state of understanding less to understanding more, you really have to, in multiple ways, wrestle with the text. So for him, I think a lot of your books should kind of look like you've gone to war with them, right? Yeah. And like, not just what you do in the book, right? The earmarking, the underlining, the highlighting, the asking questions to yourself, asking questions to the text, but then what you do after the book. Can you make this into an argument? Can you defend this position? Even if it's a position you don't agree with? What other exercises would you recommend with somebody if it is just them in a text? Because I agree with you. Like, one of the best things you can do is just get with other people and test your arguments in real time. Make sure you actually understand it. But if it's just somebody and a text, what exercises should they be doing to get the most out of it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I recommend is forming different, habits of note taking as well. So, like you sort of mentioned, the underlining and the marginalia that you produce in your own books, but then also, depending upon how much you really want to engage with this text, there's only so much that you can write in the margins, right? I have very tiny handwriting, and some of my books, there's as much written in the margins as there is on the page. Of course, then I go back and I can't read it, so it's maybe not the most productive habit all the time. But also, yeah, just taking notes separately on a separate notebook or on a computer or what have you, as a way of really asking the questions. Okay, well, what does this really mean? Does this really mean what I think it means? Where are the footnotes pointing me to go look further into this thing or into this topic? What other books are talking about this? What's the dialogue which is already happening in the tradition? Just really asking those questions is a huge part of engaging with it. And yeah, finding people to talk with about it, writing about it. Yeah, I mean, just going after it, right? Not letting it just talk to you, but interrogating the book.
Yeah, interrogating, good word. ND Irish as Matthew Minard. Am I pronouncing his last name right? Yeah.
It's Minard.
Minard, right. Is well known for his lectures on the Prima Pars on reason and theology. Yeah, great channel. And he also, I haven't got my hands on it yet, but he just has his newest one out was on Garrigue's, it's a book on final causality. I forget the title of it. What is it?
I can't remember either.
Yeah,
I should know.
It's on my list though, and I've heard very good things about it, but I have not gotten around to reading it yet. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think he actually has a forthcoming book of his own as well on moral theology. Yeah, I can't remember title that one either. Yeah, so, he works really hard. Let's all give him the kudos he deserves.
So you brought up that you've been working on metaphysics of God. What have you been producing there? What have you been researching? Because that's always a fascinating subject that we like to explore in this show.
Yeah, I mean, I taught it years ago. I taught at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. There was a core course on metaphysics, and I mostly ended up just making it about Aquinas' discussion of God, because it's who doesn't want to know that, right? And so. Mostly I focus on the Prima Pars, the treatise on divine nature, really questions 2 through 14. I mean, you can go farther, you can go into a lot of other stuff. And I'm thinking I'll probably incorporate some of the discussion of the Trinity in the questions 27 through 29 of the Prima Pars as well. So it's not so much, I'm not going to focus very much on the existence of God, because I don't think a whole lot of people who will be signing up for this seminar haven't gone over that a fair amount to begin with. Everyone's familiar with the 5 ways who would be interested in this anyhow. But yeah, really just looking at the divine attributes and looking at how we understand them, really seeing the analogical predication question, questions 12 and 13 of the Prima Pars are, they're these massive questions. I think they're 12 and 13 articles, or maybe it's the other way around. But there's so much depth in there. So really getting in there and pulling apart Aquinas' treatment of knowledge of God.
You know what? This reminds me again of Mortimer Adler, because he's got a book that I've talked about and referenced before. It's called How to Think About God, and it's like, I forget the subtitle. It's something on like for the 20th century pagan. This was before Adler became Christian. I don't think Adler became a Christian until he was like 60. And then I don't think he became a Catholic until he was like 90 something. So
he became a Catholic like the year before he died.
Yeah, the dude took his time, right? He was patient and thorough. We'll give him that. But one thing that he, and that was the reason I bring this book up. It was one of the first books that I sort of read in natural theology when I was really starting to consider the question of God as a purely philosophical consideration. And what he talks in that book, I'm probably going to, it's been a while since I've refreshed my memory on it, but he says something like this, that when he was first considering it, he actually kind of skipped the proofs for God at first, or said, didn't think much about them. But he was so interested in Aquinas' metaphysics of God, how Aquinas would defend things like God doesn't have a body, right? And he found those aspects so utterly fascinating and enriching for their own sake, even like independent of whether God exists or not, that eventually encouraged and motivated him to go back and answer the more fundamental question, right? Because he just found that stuff so enriching, so engaging, and so rigorous that it inspired him to pursue natural theology as thoroughly as he did. So I think there's something to that line of thought that I'm getting out of what you're saying. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's we have this bizarre sort of inverted anthropocentrism of how we want to think about God in the 20th, 21st centuries. where we're always sort of thinking about, why isn't God more like we want him to be? I think that's a lot of the arguments against God's existence that you find among sort of new atheist types and what have you, is really of that nature, right? Why doesn't God plan things more like I, as a human being, would plan them? Why isn't God really created more in my image instead of the other way around?
Right. We made the Pontiac Aztec. What does God make?
Yeah, right. And it's this. We do have to sort of demolish those habits of interpreting things, where we're sort of our rationality is the archetype for all reasoning, for all that is intelligible and all that should be understood. Mm-hmm. And so, no, when you read those things that Aquinas says about God's perfection and simplicity and goodness and infinity and all these other things, so wait a second. I'm trying to interpret the infinite from a finite point of view. I need to sort of break down those barriers of my own finite vision. Not that we can attain the infinite, actually, mm-hmm. but we're trying to understand something infinite, and we can't do that if we're trying to constrain it to our finite proportion of understanding. We need to find a way out of that, which really does center on that notion of analogy, I think. That we have to have this analogical understanding of all of these attributes of God. And then, I do think that does make the arguments for his existence much more intelligible.
If you wouldn't mind, Dr. Kemple, let's talk about the principle of analogy right now, because this is something that I've been writing about a lot. I don't have anything formally published on it yet, but I hope to submit some stuff soon. And I think the principle of analogy is so important for a number of reasons. One is that I think when it's properly in place and properly defended, it can actually eliminate an enormous host of objections against God from like a coherence of theism perspective, right? Because what I think analogy will allow us to do is it will give us a principled Mysterianism on pretty much everything, in the sense that, like, if we can get to the existence of God apophatically and analogically, then we should not only expect mystery with respect to God, right? But it gives us enough of a sort of buffer zone, if you will, right, through analogical predication, that even if we couldn't address a lot of the coherence objections directly, which I think we can, say like changing knowledge objections, stuff like that, we can always have that principled Mysterianism to say to the critic, look, you're just assuming way more about God than I've certainly argued, right? And you're forgetting about this principle of analogy. So you're ramming through more assumptions than you could possibly justify in your criticism. That's one thing I think that's really overlooked or underdeveloped in relation to the principle of analogy. But I think before we even get there, we should maybe just get it on the table and maybe have you explain why you think this is a legitimate metaphysical tool, why we really, I think, can't do without it, and whatever else you have to say about it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, analogy is... it's complicated, right? I mean, it's just by its very nature. And you find in Thomist writing of the 20th century, there's a lot of debate about it. It's one of those sort of like hotly debated topics that you go through certain periods in the journals, and there's like 8 or 10 articles on analogy in like the span of a year or two. And then it drops off for a little while, and then someone comes up and challenges something else.
Again, right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And a lot of it circles around, just for some context for the listeners, within the Thomistic, sort of discussion circles, you might say. A lot of it has to do with Thomas Cajetan, sort of famed commentator of Aquinas, 15th century commentator, 15th, 16th, 15th, 16th, right around that border period, right? Late 1490s, early 1500s. Because Cajetan proposes his own theory of analogy, and then everyone's debating about, well, is he interpreting Aquinas or is he proposing his own theory? And Joshua Hochschild has pretty definitively shown that he was proposing his own theory rather than Aquinas. So you have a bunch of things from Ralph McInerney from before then, where he's like, Cajetan's awful, you can't trust him on anything. And I do think Cajetan's wrong. But I don't think he's wrong as an interpreter of Aquinas, because he's not interpreting Aquinas.
Right.
So all that sort of inside baseball aside, analogy really depends upon recognizing the meanings proper to the word being. That whatever we're going to talk about in terms of analogy, any sort of analogy, does depend upon an understanding of what we mean by term being.
Mhm.
And fundamentally, there are two very different senses of the way that we use the word being, the way that we use the word is, the way we talk about what it means for something to be. On the one hand, and this is the one that's more familiar to people who studied any sort of Thomistic metaphysics or traditional metaphysics in general, it pertains to the actual existence of things. When we're talking about the actual existence of things, the fact that they exist, or the act of existence whereby this being is not nothing. And that always moves in the direction towards God. Whenever you're talking about existence in that sense, God is the prime analogate, we might say, or the analogon, to use John Canassis's favorite word when he's talking about this. But on the other hand, and this is, I'm not going to go on at too much length about this because I wrote my dissertation about it, so it's really easy for me to do. But the other sense of being that's primary in our usage is not the act of existence, but is the fact that we understand something irreducible to ourselves. That this is being as first known is this other sense. And analogy is always a sort of dynamic interplay between the two, right? That we're always talking about not just the act of existence, but we're also talking about how it's intelligible to us, how it makes some sense to us. And analogy is in that relation between those two senses of the term.
Right. So just as being comes in many ways, so does knowledge. Right. So
Yeah.
I think that's another critical consideration, that knowledge itself is an analogical term. Right.
Right. Yeah. And so, I mean, trying to navigate the tension of those two things, you find people have tendencies to try and reduce everything to one or the other.
Yes.
Right? And that's where you end up with a sort of, objective positivistic side of things, that we're talking about existence on the one hand, not that they would talk about God in that way. Or there's the sort of subjectivist side, that everything reduces to our knowledge of it. And unless you keep in mind that there's this tension between those two, I think you slip to one error or another and you lose the sense of analogy.
Maintaining healthy tension, always important, right? Especially in exercise. Now, all right, let's go even further back to basics, because people might be like, wow, this sounds like really boring stuff, guys. But this is critical stuff when it comes to metaphysics. It is, right? So there's payoff to understanding this stuff, I promise you. So for people who are totally unfamiliar, right, when we talk about like sort of analogical use or analogical predication, we're contrasting that with univocity and equivocity. So when we say, let's take some stock examples, right? That I'm a human, you're a human. I'm using the term in presumably this, the same sense both times. Mm-hmm. When I say that the man hit the ball with a bat and there's a bat flying around my room, I'm using the terms in completely unrelated sense. That's the equivocal sense. So when we're using it in the exact same sense, we have univocity. In completely unrelated senses, we have equivocity. And then analogy is supposed to be kind of like somewhere in the middle, like as Norris Clark talks about it, like similarity in difference. And I'd be curious if you agree with Clark. He says, like, to really sort of understand analogy, we kind of have to try and like run up and down the chain of usage, right? Up and down or over and across the chain of usage to really sort of appreciate this. And so a stock example would be goodness, right? Like, this is good coffee. This is a good conversation, right? I obviously don't mean exactly the same thing when I'm talking about the goodness of coffee and the goodness of the conversation, but I don't mean completely unrelated things either. It's a stretch concept, to borrow from Norris Clark again. So yeah, I don't know if you want to build on any of that at all, but just to kind of like come back to even more of the fundamentals of what we're doing here with analogy might be helpful.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I've always, I think the talking about analogy is somehow sort of between equivocity and univocity is useful to try and situate it in our own minds. But really, I don't know that it actually describes what's going on there. Right.
Yeah. It's a starting analogy for analogy, but it limps.
Yeah.
To be sure.
Yeah. Because equivocity, right, when you're using the same words or the same sound, really, or the same spelling of a word to mean two totally different things. I mean, there isn't really any sameness at all there, right?
It's just an accident of language, right? Yeah.
Right. And it's based upon convention, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not really based upon any ontological sameness or even an ontological difference, really. It's an accident of difference, not a difference in the beings of the things themselves.
Right. Excellent.
So to go back to the point about something like goodness, though, right? To think about goodness, the goodness of the conversation, the goodness of the coffee. When we're thinking about, well, what is it that really makes these two things the same? Like we know there's something that we mean that's the same, but trying to figure out just what it is difficult, right? Because what is it that's similar in coffee and a conversation? That's a question that we probably ought to ask ourselves when we're trying to think about what we mean by terms like good or true, or even terms not so lofty and transcendental, like we can use the word fun in a sort of analogous way. Obviously going to the movies might be fun in a way which is different from leg day, right? It's on my mind. It's leg day for me today.
Definitely a different kind of fun, but still
definitely a different kind of fun, but still fun, right? In some way, the fun of a challenge as opposed to the fun of relaxation. What is it that makes these things the same, despite the difference in the structures of the things themselves? And so part of it does actually relate, I think, to our knowledge of them, right? Not to say that our knowledge constitutes them this way, but our familiarity with these things helps us to understand them as genuinely good. Someone who has no interest in metaphysics might think that this conversation isn't good, right? And certainly that this conversation isn't fun. But when you do see that thing in itself, right? When you see the way that it has being, you can see the goodness in it. You can see perhaps the fun in it as well. Similarly with coffee or with anything which is a matter of taste, right? We have to have some knowledge of the thing to understand what's good about it. Someone who's a coffee connoisseur might think that my coffee isn't good because it's just a regular drip coffee that I made in my 10-year-old coffee pot this morning. It's not a fine espresso or anything like that. So there's a relation here between the knowledge and the being of the thing, which helps us to understand what makes it good.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I mean, it seems like it's something related to a due actuality, right? That there's a certain due actuality that is present in the coffee that allows me to say this is good. There's a certain due actuality in this conversation. We'll leave that to the listeners to decide if it's actually there, which allows me to say that it's good. But that mode of actuality is not the same thing, right? So there's similarity and difference there. And it seems to me that even very fundamentally, we need the principle of analogy just to make sense of change, because for change, we're going to need distinctions between act and potency. But then we have analogy of being right there. Like potential being is clearly not the same thing as actual being, right? But it's not completely nothing either, right? So like it seems like right at the get-go, we need analogy or something very much like analogy just to get the whole metaphysical project started on good footing, right?
Yeah, and that's one where, oh boy, does that get difficult to talk about, especially when you get into like later scholasticism and some of the debates that they have over that. Gosh, that's part of why Suarez messed everything up.
So there's your summary right there, folks. Yeah.
Yeah. Be wary of Francisco Suarez. That's all I'll say there.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. No, good stuff. I'm glad we got that on the table because, again, I understand that these kind of the rudiments of metaphysics, like the rudiments of music theory, or something like that, aren't the most fun things to talk about, right? But they are often the most important things to talk about, right? You gotta. And maybe talk about that in relation to just education, right? I mean, I think that there's probably a more general theme there that we could draw upon.
Well, right, and I mean the importance of metaphysics. Yeah, I mean if you're not into it and you're just sort of like, okay, this is it's very abstract and it's way out there, and what does this matter for my day-to-day life and how I'm going to go about the rest of my day or my week or my weekend? Metaphysics is not going to make your weekend probably a whole lot of fun, but really that ordering that comes from it, right? Seeing that there's principles by which the rest of everything else is ordered. So questions like the metaphysics, the intelligibility, the approachability of the question of God, it has a huge impact on how you order and structure your life as a whole. That's not to get too sidetracked. One of the other things that I write on and work on is Charles Sanders Peirce, who's this sort of controversial figure for a lot of reasons. Really the founder of pragmatism, but not pragmatism as any self-professed pragmatists practice it. Sort of his own branch of things. He talks about this a lot, that it makes a huge difference for your life whether or not you believe in God, whether or not you have a well-founded belief in God, and whether or not you think upon the reasons for that belief. That this really does order and structure your why for doing things. So even when it comes back to something like education, this is one of the things that I sort of get on Twitter and yell at the clowns about every once in a while. That we have this notion of like there's a stopping point to your education, right? It's like, okay, well, you're done with high school and then you're going to go to college, and if you want a higher paying, fancier job, you go on for like a master's degree in business or something like that.
Right.
Your master's in business administration, and anything that you go on for any education after that is purely academic, right? Aside from those few specialized fields where they demand or want a higher degree or something like that. But that it's all career focused, it's all career oriented, it's all I'm getting an education to get a job so that I can go live my life, as though education isn't an integral part of your life. Right.
It's purely an instrument, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think that when you, to sort of bring metaphysics into this, metaphysics being this sort of high, lofty, abstract, purposeless seeming sort of education, it's when you sort of get into it a little bit, and you start to study those things and you start to see the truth of some of them, you're like, wow, I could study this literally for the rest of my life and never come close to exhausting it, which to some people might sound very boring. But to me, and I think to anyone who actually has studied any of it, it's like, wow, I can actually get joy out of this, doing this for the rest of my life. This is an inexhaustible source of joy,
right?
To study these things, to understand them, and to see how everything that you study can fold into that and be a part of that continuing pursuit of knowledge and pursuit of truth.
Right, right. Yeah, this is excellent. I see some comments and questions there. We'll tend to those in a minute, so submit whatever you have. But let me ask you one more question, Dr. Kemple. You're appointed czar of the Department of Education, right? You've got full coercive power, right? Libertarians are screaming, right? What does your curriculum look like? What does the whole structure look like? Soup to, give us soup to nuts, right? How are you fixing our country? Yeah.
I'm gonna steal a line from Chesterton, right? Which is that the oldest things ought to be taught to the youngest people. That we are gonna bring back the trivium, right? And we're also gonna heavily subsidize homeschooling. And really, I mean,
I love that thought. So we homeschool, right? For a million different reasons.
Right.
Build on that a little bit. Why? And what does that look like? Yeah.
Well, I mean, okay. So we have, first of all, the sort of fundamental truth that parents are the primary educators of their children, right? And that's the way it ought to be, right? That it's not.
Parents aren't supposed to like outsource all their moral duties. What?
Yeah. But also, I mean, I think that's good for parents too, because it helps keep you, again, learning yourself and understanding and studying things. And even if they're very basic fundamental things like grammar, it's good for us to continually refresh that knowledge in ourselves.
Yeah. It's good to not be always able to say like, oh, just ask your math teacher, right? No, it's like you know what, like 1 + 1, come on.
Yeah. And I mean, I think some form of group schooling or public schooling is always going to be with us, right? There's always going to be parents who can't do this themselves. But that should be the exception rather than the norm, I think. And also, I think things like homeschooling co-ops are great. It's a great way to get some of that knowledge that you yourself don't have as a parent, that you can have your children taught in and taught more successfully, then you can teach them.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's important, right? When we talk about homeschooling, right, we don't mean that like you have to be a hyper specialist in everything. Like, of course not, right? You're going to be bringing in hopefully other like people like Dr. Kemple and stuff like that to help facilitate the education of your children. But you do assume a broad moral responsibility for the general development of your children, right?
Right, and I think that's something that helps keep parents, involved and invested in it. It's very easy to like, oh, you're going off to class, to school for 7 hours a day or whatever, and then you're doing your homework, and I'll look over it in the morning or whatever, and then just sort of ship you back off. I'll spend my 5 minutes while you spend 8 hours, 9 hours or whatever involved in these things. No, I mean that's grossly disproportionate, I think, and so getting back a sense of that proportionate involvement of parents in their children's education, whatever could be done to foster that as czar of the Department of Education would be really the primary focus. Because honestly, I think the university system as it is right now is fundamentally broken, and I don't know that there's any fixing it.
You don't say.
Yeah.
So as this, I'm fascinated in this. We can talk about the university system. I would love to. Certainly, I think it's what's the term that the kids use today? A hot mess, right? What sort of constraints as the czar, the benevolent czar, are you putting on the homeschooling curriculums, if any? Because I would imagine you'd put some constraints on there, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, you have to have something, right? You can't just sort of let it go with, do whatever you will. I'm not a libertarian. Sorry, libertarians, but at least not on this point. No, I mean, you have to have some sort of basic fundamental focus on. I mean, much more, I think, on language than on math and science. I think math and science are good, wonderful things, and we should all study them more. Certainly, I wish I had studied math more rigorously as a young student. But yeah, this ability to write well, to read well, to understand what's being said, really, bring it back to the trivium, to be grounded in those three subjects, because that gives the dexterity of mind which someone needs to be a good citizen, to be a good member of any sort of political organization, especially where they are responsible in some way for the direction of that polity. Right.
So related to that, then, what about moral and virtue education?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a harder one. But I do think, some basic sort of virtue ethic education would go a long way to helping that as well. It doesn't have to be Aristotle. It probably should be. But if you want to be a Stoic as well, I suppose that's not the worst thing in the world.
Yeah, right. Even if we don't have a full Christian curriculum or something like that, like if we had a basic Stoic curriculum, I think we'd probably be generally better off than we are right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, hell, even honest good old Epicureanism, as it was actually practiced in the day, would be better than what we have now. This sort of moral relativistic values clarification sense of things, which has trickled its way down into schools.
100%.
And I mean, I do think it would be better if it were Christian in a sense, but I think that's unfeasible for the world that we live in today. That really, atheism or agnosticism, recognized as a religion, is one of the largest in the United States today. And so, while it's not an ideal pluralistic sort of structure of our society, it is the one that we have, and we have to sort of acknowledge the reality of that and not try and shove it down people's throats who are unwilling to swallow it, I think.
Right. Well, let me ask you about that, right? Because, I mean, not everyone agrees with that. And it seems like the people who don't agree with that the most are those who would disagree with a lot of the things that we believe in, right? Clearly, there are people politically who think, yeah, we're in a pluralistic society, but I should shove relativism down people's throats, right? And I'm trying really hard to do it, right? So from a pragmatic standpoint, a practical standpoint, are we losing ground on the things that we think society really needs by being just more defensive about it, right? Rather than saying, no, actually, I think this liberal project has largely failed, that these organizing principles around a pluralistic society were either unsustainable or unrealistic or theoretically impossible to begin with. And we need to start pushing forward a little bit more aggressively. Tread into that however you want.
Yeah, I mean, this is dangerous ground, because we do see this, right? And if you look at sort of the divergent political landscape of people within Christianity, Catholicism, left-right politics, and all these different sorts of things. I mean, you see this sort of emerging, growing sense of integralism, right? This idea of, okay, well, let's just forget the whole liberal project, the whole pluralistic society. Mm-hmm. Let's go full bore, church and state together, ruling as one. I myself, I mean, I understand the appeal of that, and I won't for a second deny that there's a considerable appeal to that. I myself do, and here I'll probably get myself into hot water with some people. I'm a Maritanian when it comes to a lot of this. Jacques Maritain, what he writes, it's an outline in a sense, but what he writes in Integral Humanism, I think, is the more difficult, but perhaps that's an indication of better, or being a better approach to these things. That it's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle when you have democratic liberal society to say, okay, you know what, we've had all these rights for this long time for you, the individual person. Now we're going to say you don't have them anymore. Freedom of religion, that's gone. Freedom of conscience, that's you got it a little bit, but for the most part, no. Really hard to put that genie back in the bottle, and I don't think there's any way to really tread the integralist path except through violent measures, and in a way that is not in any sense yet justified. Right. Not to say it couldn't be at some point if things got much worse, but it's incumbent upon us not to let them get much worse, to try and sort of preserve the safety and well-being of people, and to win people over by appeals to their humanity rather than through force of arms.
I like that you said appeals to humanity and not necessarily logic, right? The latter might be too optimistic, right?
Well, and I mean, that's this is one of these things that I've been reading a lot of rhetoric lately, so it's very prominent in my mind, reading Aristotle and Cicero and these great thinkers in the rhetorical tradition, that there's nothing wrong about an appeal to emotion or an appeal to an ethical appeal, right? Nobility, in a sense, as a way of persuading people. Because it's, while you want to be rational and reasonable in the arguments you're providing, that's not always what's going to arouse the proper response from people.
Right.
We are complex creatures of not only intellect but also emotions. Yeah. And those emotions are an integral part of what we are, and there's nothing wrong with using one part to bring the whole along.
Yeah, and that's so I want to turn back, because I'm a Maritanian as well, and like in almost every way possible, actually, right? But I mean, Aristotle he got good like basic sales. Right. Like any good marketer would tell you, like, you start with appeals to emotions, right? And then you bring in reasons. Unfortunately, the reasons that are typically brought up are more like rationalizations, like when somebody's already emotionally invested. So like, we don't want to do that. Right. But the point being, as any good advertising book will tell you, is like, you don't lead with logic, right? You make appeals to the gut and then the heart. And then like once you have the passions roused, then you bring in the reasons so somebody can, justify the direction that you've already got them moving in. Aristotle just got that, right? He just yeah. Mm-hmm. That's why I tell people, like, you want a good ad, like you want to like understand, like you don't need how to win friends and influence people. Like, just go back to Aristotle, right? He understood this stuff well.
Yeah, and what I always find really interesting is the one that gets probably talked about the least, but is probably the most important, is what he calls the ethical appeal, right? Is this, what will do more to win people over than anything else is if they think that you are a good person. We can't really be good rhetoricians if people don't respect us, which is an interesting notion, right? That for some reason seems to have just sort of dropped off the map, right? It's this sort of either it's this pure emotional appeal, the sort of fantasy or picture that you're creating, or it's this pure logical appeal, this pure reason, which is totally independent of anything concrete in particular. And no, really, it has to be sort of, in a sense, invested in you yourself as the person speaking.
Right.
People have to think that, okay, this guy's got something worth listening to, or this gal has something worth listening to. Let's be politically correct here, right? No, I mean, really, that this person does have something, that they're a person worth, he or she is a person worth listening to. I don't think we have a whole lot of sense of why that's important, or why that was important. And I think part of the recovery of that is pretty crucial.
I agree. Yeah, excellent. Super fun conversation, as I knew it would be. Let's take some questions now. Saul says, cheers, gentlemen. He's got good, sorry, I picked the wrong one. That wasn't the question. Here's the question. Saul wants to know, what is a good introduction for teens or beginners to metaphysics, and why is it important to have a foundation in metaphysics?
Oh, okay. Well, a good introduction. Whew. I mean, I guess it depends in some sense on just how smart and invested these teens are.
Talk about Meritan. I mean,
yeah.
This is probably not for teens. I don't know if this one would be good for teens.
I mean, honestly, I'd go back to the one you held up before, which was Norris Clark's One of the Many.
Yeah.
It's going to be a challenge for them, but it's probably one of the more approachable texts for metaphysics. Certainly, it's the kind of one that it's got good sort of guiding discussion questions at the end of each chapter.
Yes.
So if you're going to read it with your teen, and it gives you that direction to get into it and to sort of investigate some of what's going on there. And maybe a way of actually sort of connecting that with the importance of having a foundation in it. Although it's not what I would call an explicitly metaphysical work, Plato's Apology, where Socrates is giving his defense before the court of Athens when he's been brought up on these charges, it's in a way, it's kind of metaphysical. And I think it'll both be a good intro for teens as well, and something that shows the importance of the foundation of it. Because there it's talking about, it's the alpha and the omega of the, life that's been investigated, the life that we're inquiring into, the examined life. Because really that's what metaphysics is, in a sense, right? It's the farthest away from where we begin in our own intellectual journey in some sense, but it's also the foundation. It's the foundation of reality is what we're questioning after in metaphysics, the foundation of all things. And so if you're asking the question, why at all, you're asking a metaphysical question. So,
it's the search for the highest truths and the deepest causes.
Yeah, that we are inclined towards by nature, as Aristotle starts off as metaphysics. All men by nature desire to know.
It won't help you build a microwave oven, though.
No, it won't, but it'll tell you why you should or shouldn't.
Yeah, good point. Tim says, hello to you, Tim. Here's a good question from Denver Bros Gaming. Hey, speaking of gaming, I don't know if this is a good tip or not. We'll see how it pays off. But so we have the Nintendo Switch. I love to play it with my kids when we're hanging out. But very often when we're like doing our Mario Kart sessions, I have the audiobooks of like Plato's Apology or The Republic going. So like, when I'm burning around those the time trials in kart with my kids, like at least they're getting steeped in, and they're all very young, but I want them to just sort of be steeped in this stuff, right? And for a lot of these classics, I had these books lying around, Brian, just because I just did an episode on like a basic like self-learners curriculum, like the Republic. I get it, people are busy, but you can find these just being read on YouTube. right
No.
Just like make that your commute for the next couple of months, right? Like there's like, all right, maybe you don't have to go and do the full how to read a book method yet. I would suggest getting there, but if nothing else, just having this on in the background, it'll do something, right, Brian? Want to do something?
Oh yeah, I mean, and I think listening is something that I'm terrible. I'm a terrible listener. Go ahead and put that out there. It's something that I will get distracted, and I will have something on in the background and realize 30 minutes later that I haven't paid attention to a single word that has been said. So I don't think it's something that everyone can do. I do think that there's different sort of
different types of people for sure.
Yeah. But I do like to listen to things, and I do find it's an interesting way of learning. I have to do it focused. I have to do it with a notepad in front of me, and like my computer screen's turned off, or everything minimized or whatever. But I say this as someone whose principal form of educating is I record lectures and then make other people listen to them. But yeah, I mean, certain other things you can have on in the background. It sort of depends on what they are. I love podcasts about history. Sure. I do it while I'm like cooking and eating and cleaning up. It's a great way of just sort of having that continually, when you're engaged with something that isn't really taking up a lot of your focus, like playing Mario Kart, or
it depends who you're playing against. Like sometimes you just like do the chill stroll, but sometimes people get pretty they get pretty sweaty. So then then you start to lose focus. Right.
But yeah, you can just quick last word on that. You can have a lot of good formation of your own habits of thinking by having things going in when you're doing relatively mindless tasks.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
yeah, good stuff. All right, so here's his actual question. Denver Bros wants to know, what are your favorite arguments against materialism, and how would you deal with aggressive atheists who don't understand the 5 ways? So 2 questions there. Brian, take them in whatever order you please.
Yeah, I'll talk about the aggressive atheists first of all. And I think I kind of mentioned this in our last conversation as well. Most of them aren't actually interested in discussing these things, right? So it's pearls before swine to waste too much time trying to talk to them. You can usually figure out by asking a few simple questions of what do you mean by this word, or what do you mean by this concept, to see if they're really interested in having a conversation. Mm-hmm. Usually if they just fire back immediately with, well, no, what do you mean about this? Or show me the evidence or something like that, you can just throw your hands up, kick the dust off your feet and move on. Right. Which is your typical aggressive interlocutor.
Yeah, and to be fair, that is by no means like a monopoly of new atheists, right? Like you have aggressive interlocutors and on just anything. And I think that's a good general policy, right? Like I think it's worth like maybe testing the waters with a few just like probing questions at first, like get a feel of the temperature. And then, yeah, if it's not worth wasting your time, it's just not worth wasting your time, right?
Yeah, and so your typical person that you're going to encounter on Facebook or Twitter or Reddit or wherever is going to be of that sort, right? So spend your energy where it's worth spending it. Now, as far as a favorite argument against materialism, there's 2 that I've sort of played around with the most and found the most success in having conversations with people who subscribe to materialism. Usually they're people who sort of unconsciously subscribe to materialism. They don't realize that they're materialists, but they are. Excuse me. And the first is just really talking about the meanings of most words. That most of what people mean by words that they use are not anything that they could answer in terms of what the material structure is. So you ask someone, well, what do you mean, what does it mean to be human? And you start talking about, okay, how does a human being actually live, or what makes a human being to be human, really human, what we really mean by that word. They're not going to say, they might say something like your DNA, but then when you press them on that and say, okay, well, how does that explain being human? How does that explain this conversation that we're having right now? Is this conversation part of being human? Most of them would say, yeah. They're not going to say that it's just DNA, or if they are, they're not really interested in having that conversation anyway, because they're going to have this huge explanatory gap between how you get from DNA to having a conversation about metaphysics or something like that. And the second one is the reality of relations. That relations are real things. That your mother is really your mother, and there's a real relationship of maternity between her and you, and a filial relation or something along those lines between a child and a parent. But you can't point to it, right? You can't grab it. You can't grab that relation, or that a spouse is really a spouse. A husband and wife are really husbands and wives. But that marriage isn't something that you can go and poke in the ribs. Right? Most people want to recognize the reality of these relations, but there are things that you can't identify as having a physical material structure in any way. So
yeah, I've got a million arguments I love against materialism. I think at the end of the day, it's one of the most fantastically difficult things to even entertain as a possibility once you really probe its depths, right? Like, it just, which is what popped me out of being a materialist, right? The deeper I went into it, I'm just like, yeah, they're like, this just cannot be true, right? Like I would much sooner be an idealist than I would be a materialist these days, easily, right? Mm-hmm.
No, I mean, I sort of think, if you follow it to its absolute logical extremes, you end up with a limitative materialism. So someone like the Churchlands, Paul and Patricia.
The Rosenbergs and the Dennett's and those guys. Yeah. And I think they are the most consistent, right? I think in a way, like these are the guys you want to read because like if you want to weigh out of materialism, just go read the Eliminativists, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what I was about to say, is that it's sort of a reductio ad absurdum, right? I mean, they have reduced themselves to an absurd position and they're sticking to it, right?
So it's like it's a great thing to see that like how much they agree with non-materialists or theists about, right? Theists will be like, hey, look, you guys can't explain consciousness, and they'll be like, look, we can't explain consciousness doesn't exist. What? No, it does, right? Like it's your starting point that's off, right? Like, hey, you guys can't explain meaning or determinacy of meaning or determinacy of facts, and they're like, that's correct. There is no meaning. There is no determinacy of facts. What? Right? Well, clearly you mean something by what you're saying, right? So like it is just like this constant reductio. But the thing with the eliminativists is they're willing to take the nuclear option, right? They're willing to just like bite every single bullet until they're just like so full of bullets that you just cannot seriously entertain their position anymore, right?
All right. And I mean, you can tell it's not how they live. Like they don't live in accordance with the theories that they hold to, which to me is like, okay, why bother holding the theory then? What's the point?
You had these constant, reductions to the absurd, and just almost, a sort of. Maybe they have moments when they I couldn't even imagine that. How could you even have a moment when you live consistently within a limitless worldview, right? Like maybe you have moments. No, I just don't think you can. So it is a constant performance contradiction as well, right? Like
I imagine they invoke it a lot when they do anything which would otherwise be found morally dubious, right? Well, okay, it's not real anyway, right? So marriage isn't real, so my infidelity is excused, right?
Right, but then they're on Twitter 5 minutes later condemning people's political opinions on any number of issues, right? So it's just, pot kettle
becomes
black.
pure will to power,
right? But then, of course, like if any argument for God goes through, which I think there are, that itself is a direct refutation of materialism, right? So, like I think like you got two options here. One is like you just push the materialist position through till its nonsense is apparent enough, or you just push the metaphysics through until materialism just is eliminated, right? Yeah.
I mean, you ask questions long enough and doggedly enough, and you either end up an absolute nihilist or a theist. And I think there's no middle ground to end up in.
I'm with you. I said this on Twitter the other day, and the podcast. I like, to me, the options are not theism or atheism or theism or materialism. The options are theism or radical skepticism, right? Yeah. Like a nihilism, radical skeptical about everything, right? All right, let's do one more. This has been super fun. At least I think so. So Saul says his first deep audiobook was Confessions. It worked. Then Modern Physics and Ancient Faiths with Dr. Stephen Barr. Yeah, great guy. He's been on the show a number of times. That was tough. Currently struggling with Nicomachean and Ethics, frequently rewinding. Yeah, you can't do Aristotle in audiobooks. No. You can't do St. Thomas Aquinas either. It works for Plato because, dialogues and what, like it. So there's just some where I think it's going to work well, and there's others where you just need to sit down with the text. Even if you are somebody who can generally listen to things, like I don't think Aristotle is going to work for that. A book on physics is also a hard no, right?
Yeah. Well, no, and I mean the reason for that with Aristotle is quite simply that most of what we have of his are basically his class notes, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot that isn't said. There's a lot that's said obliquely. Where I sort of imagine all the time. This is how I read Aristotle. Sitting there with lots of marginalia and lots of close notes and everything. I imagine Aristotle walking around as he did while he taught, and he's got this scroll in front of him, which is the Nicomachean Ethics or something, and he reads a line off, and then he talks for 15 minutes after he reads that line.
Right.
And a lot of reading him is trying to figure out what was he saying while he's walking around.
Reading between the lines, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. While he was walking around the Lyceum. I point to the shirt every time I say it. Right?
Well, speaking of, let's finish with that. Tell us more about what you're working on and where people can check out the Lyceum, what that is, and why they should head over there. Put in all the plugs you like, Dr. Kemple.
Yeah. So as I mentioned at the start of the show, it's an online persistent platform for continuing education in philosophy and the trivium. And Latin. If you want to learn Latin, we have a class. Everyone can participate. $10 a month. You can't beat it. So we sort of constantly in conversation. We have happy hour once a week, open chats. Come in, talk philosophy, take some seminars, listen to lectures. Every member gets access to all of the previous lectures as well. So there's well over 100 hours worth of stuff to listen to at this point.
Awesome.
Politics, Aristotle, Aquinas, semiotics, phenomenology. We're covering lots of stuff. It's a lot of exciting stuff. You can find it at lyceum.institute. Just that, lyceum.institute, or plug it into Google or find it on Twitter. It's good fun. It's a good challenge. It's a good way to grow in philosophical habit. People will challenge you there. So
that's what we want. That's what we want. Now, where can people link up with you on the social medias? You mentioned that you keep a good eye on Twitter. You make sure that people stay nice and keep their thinking straight there. So yeah, what's your handle? Yeah,
it's at Real Brian Kemple. And you can find links on there to both the Lyceum and to Reality. It's all sort of centralized on my profile. So,
well,
yeah,
groovy.
And you can find me on Facebook too, but I'm just going to ignore you. So,
yeah, I'm terrible at Facebook. I do almost nothing on there.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I'll link all that in the show notes. Dr. Brian Kemple, as always, it's been a blast, and we will make sure that we continue this conversation in the near future. Thank you so much.
Yeah.